how to peer review articles. I know we all peer review, so I'm not coming as an expert. This is an open discussion, so I'm kind of setting the frame and presenting kind of how I do things, but please interrupt, give comments, give your own perspectives as we go on. This is a learning experience for all of us. So I'll begin with two personal stories to kind of give some background. The first, my PhD days, well, both of them from when I was a PhD student. One, I took an introductory course, an overall course on how to do research and so on, and there was a session on peer review, the peer review process, also talked about reviewing articles. I remember that the professor, Blake Ives, he was at Louisiana State University at that time, he said that one of the biggest problems that journal editors have with PhD students reviewing for them is just to get them to accept an article. And because PhD students, they just criticize, tear down, and it's just so hard for them to accept an article. And that really struck me as irony, because obviously PhD students don't have a lot of experience, and yet somehow they tend to be the most critical. So the lesson I took from there is that it's not a virtue to identify problems, because a lot of times we have this idea that we're better intellectuals if we can break down and pinpoint the problems in someone's argument. But that's not what makes us a great intellectual. It's rather someone who can help people to improve their work. So that's the first lesson I took from there. But then I got some practice very early on. So a fellow PhD student in that program asked me to just do a friendly review of an article he was working on. And I took time, I read it, I gave detailed comments, and I had very critical comments on it. And this is a good friend of mine, but then when he saw my review, he was shocked. He said that, wow, I said like, this is so violent, or something like that. And I felt really about that. And actually now looking back many years, I realized I really didn't know what he was doing. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand that type of research, but I still had a lot of criticism to give anyways. And eventually he got that work published in it's a CNRS Rank 2 journal, so a pretty highly ranked journal, so the substance. But that experience really marked me, and it taught me again that being critical, that's really just finding the criticisms, has very little correspondence with actually helping people. And so with that, I'd like you to look at this for a moment. So here's the author submitting article for consideration, and we are those people on the two lines. So which of those is us? Which of us, which one do we identify with? Because those are peer reviews. Okay. Well, the goal of the presentation and the tone I want to set is that this is not my view today of peer reviewing and of what we should be doing when we peer review. So there's three main topics. First of all, why should we peer review? And also, why should we not peer review? Then, when we are peer reviewing, what are our goals? What are we trying to do? And we're asked to make a recommendation. What are the criteria for making the recommendation? And then finally, my personal procedure of how practically I carry out a review. So there's so many articles on how to review. There's been a lot of sessions. I've attended sessions. Even this summer, I attended a session. There's a workshop where the SKEMA paper development workshop. I attended that. There's a session on reviewing articles. I got tips there. People have so many different perspectives. I'm not presenting this by any means as this is the way. That's why it's important for you to interrupt, ask questions, give comments, your own experience, so that we can all learn from this time. So this is from my perspective. So first, why should we peer review? The first reason is I think there's a sense of ethical responsibility. Basically, if we submit articles for consideration at journals or conferences, we would like to get at least 2 thoughtful, helpful views from it. So there's a basic principle of fairness that whosoever submits should feel a responsibility to review 2 articles for others. And a professor during my PhD program brought up this principle, and this is very interesting. Not everyone thinks in this way, and some people don't necessarily agree with it, but I think it's just the ground level of fairness. And it changes the perspective so that it's not as if when someone asks us to review articles, we're nice by saying, yes, I'll review, but it's rather that if we keep on excuses and we never review, then we're not being nice. We have a responsibility to do it. Then a second perspective is that peer reviewing is a crucial aspect of our continuous education as professionals. It's we get a lot out of peer reviewing articles. When we review for high quality journals and conferences, then we see what other scholars targeting those journals are, especially if they're kind of journals, conferences we would like to publish in. We see what others are doing. And unfortunately, not all journals do this, but a lot of them will give us the comments from other reviewers on the channel. So we learn what other experts are thinking, and we compare it with what we saw. It's a crucial learning experience for us to keep up and to continually learn, understand the standards. When we make recommendations and then we see how the editor responds, this gives us feedback on making better recommendations and how our articles might be reviewed. So we really benefit a lot when we do this. And another aspect of this is when you consider it, the peer review process takes anywhere from 1 year to 2 years between when an article is submitted to when it is accepted, and then usually, depending on if it's published online or published in print, takes another 6 months or even another 1 year to actually appear in the databases. And if our database has an embargo, it might be like 2 to 4 years between submission and the article is available to the public. Well, we get to see the cutting edge, newest research 2 to 4 years earlier. And so we know what's on the frontier, especially if it's something in our field. So it's a way of really keeping up with what's going on. Okay, so these are perspectives of why we should actively peer review. Then why should we not peer review? So that's when we are invited to peer review an article, when should we say no? The first is if there's a conflict of interest. And I'll talk about this in the next slide when I talk more about ethics of peer reviewing. What exactly is a conflict of interest? I'll come to that. Then another aspect which is very important is that the whole idea of peer review is that some authors, some researchers have published, some scholars have done some work, and they would like their peers, that is other scholars who are knowledgeable in this area, to evaluate the scholarly merit of what they submitted. Therefore, if I am not knowledgeable in that area, if I'm not an expert, I'm not qualified to peer review, even if for some reason the editor contacted me. I need to at least look at the abstract, this general subject. I need to say, am I qualified? And if I'm not qualified, I have a responsibility to say no.
Immediately.
That's right away. At least read the abstract, the introduction, at the very least, to make that decision. Because we've probably had people review our work, and we could tell that the reviewer did not know what they were talking about. They don't know the subject area. We shouldn't do that to others. So I see there's at least one of 3 kinds of expertise that we need to be an expert of. It's almost never we're experts in all 3 or even 2, but at least one of these. One is we may be experts in the area of theory. So that's a general, the logical way of thinking, the logical argumentation, chains of causality. That general area of thinking, whether maybe it's a particular area of like Giddens structuration theory or diffusion of innovations. If it's a body of theory that we use, that we're familiar with, that qualifies us. Second, it might be the practical application domain. For instance, my research is on open content, so like open source software, Wikipedia. Even if they use a theory I'm not familiar with, I know the phenomenon, I know the kind of things, the way things work, the way the real practitioners think and operate. So that gives me special insight. If someone maybe does a lot of work with clothing retail, they know the clothing retail industry differs from others, and maybe they don't understand the methodology, they don't know the theory, but they know that context, that also qualifies us. And finally, the research methodology. If we are an expert, that means we're not just bumbling around, but we really have a solid grasp on that research methodology, such as if we know case study research, we understand how to do a proper case study and what is not proper, or if it's a particular statistical technique that we know very well, that also qualifies us. Okay, so at least one of these, and one of them is sufficient, but it has to be at least one. If none of these matches, we have say no, even if it's in our general discipline.
A question?
Yes.
Can I? When you talk about theoretical domain, for example, like let's take an example of human resource management. A professor who is in human resource management, may not be necessarily expert in the domain of knowledge management. And most of the conventional journals, what they do is, they have a editorial review board, and they try to send to them first. They make this board of reviewers, and if somebody does not accept it, I think then it probably goes to other reviewers, outside.
Okay.
Like for example, I recently received a review request from KMRP journal. I'm nowhere connected to that, but it's rank 3 journal, CNRS. And I had to decline, and it was knowledge management, and somebody had recommended my name, and I don't know who recommended. But my question is, now when you say theoretical knowledge domain, human resource management, knowledge management comes as a part of human resource management. Some people actually accept it. So is it fair?
Okay, when I say theoretical knowledge domain, I mean something much more narrow than just knowledge management. I mean, I'm sorry, because I'm recording, let me repeat the question. So the question is, if someone, and verify if I understand your question correctly. So if for instance, you're in human resource management, very broad, but your knowledge management, and someone sent you a human resources management topic, because you're in knowledge management, because is it appropriate to accept that? So when I say theoretical knowledge domain, for me, knowledge management, human resource management, those are disciplines, and those are not sufficiently narrow. When I say, for example, maybe they send something on, maybe it's a finance journal, but they have an article on communities of practice, which is a particular kind of knowledge management, and I'm an information system, happen to know community of practice. I'm not. I'll give you that as an example. Even though the finance, I don't know much about that, but I know communities of practice very well, then I'm qualified, because that's a body of theory. So I'm not talking about disciplines are too broad. It's not, no one is an expert in every aspect of their discipline, but I'm talking much more narrowly, a theoretical way of thinking. If you notice here, none of these three, I didn't say discipline. It's not enough that you are in the same discipline, because disciplines are too broad. These are much more narrow than discipline to qualify you to be an expert to review an article. Now, a lot of theories only within a discipline or primarily within a discipline. So the theoretical knowledge would primarily be a subset of discipline, but a lot of theories cross disciplines. And so I think even if it's from a different discipline, but you know that theory well, you're qualified. I don't know if others have other perspectives. This might.
Okay, I got it. Yeah.
Any other comments or other perspectives on this? Like what qualifies you to say yes?
What I have found is that if the area or the subject are particularly interesting to your own research, then it is worthwhile to dig and try and take advantage of this position that you have to both learn more about the same particular subject within the discipline, and possibly even be able to contribute with your own insights to make the article even better.
Okay. Now that's an interesting perspective. So you said if it's close enough, it's worthwhile more to know more about it to qualify yourself. It's interesting because, like in some seminars I attended, people have mentioned that, but I personally, if off the bat, I'm not confident that I'm knowledgeable or expert in that area, I don't accept. For me, if I have to read more to become qualified enough, for me personally, not expert enough to say yes for that. But I that said, I mean, I respect the other perspective because I know some people, they do quite a lot of work, they do a lot of reading just so that they can do a review. So that's
Actually, I wasn't
laudable
saying
as
that
well.
I would accept something if I'm not qualified enough. It is just that it is at the edge.
Yeah. Yes, I understand that.
And
When it's
hereby,
just at the edge, yes.
and hereby,
Okay.
I may have some insight that the
Okay.
other author doesn't have, which
Okay.
may help him.
Okay.
If it's only to say, oops, no, I do have to read quite a bit more, maybe, etc., of course, that's not helpful. And I wouldn't accept in that particular case. I found out quite a number of articles because of that reason.
Okay. Okay. So, other reasons to say no? Well, very practically, when we say yes, there's always a deadline given, usually within 1 month. We have to look at our schedule. If we cannot realistically finish it in the time we say yes, we should say no. Because we've all had experiences, we submitted articles, and they take forever for reviewers to come back. We should not be that reviewer. So now, on the other hand, we're all busy, and if we always say, "Oh, I don't have time," then we'll never say yes. So there's an aspect where we have to make time, but we have to be realistic also. Then another aspect that, and this is kind of a counterpoint of the earlier point I made, where we have a responsibility to say yes. Sometimes we get a lot of invitations. For me, I have seasons. There's some seasons where I don't get many invitations, then suddenly I'm getting a lot. And so if I'm being overwhelmed, where yes, I can do one or two, but I can't do all the ones that are coming to me, then we should be selective. And in that kind of situation, personally, I don't feel obligated to review for journals or conferences that are much lower than the quality that I normally submit to. Because if I have to prioritize, then I'll pick the ones that I'm going to learn from the most. So that's me personally. Yes.
Yeah, I would add that it is not wise to accept invitations below the quality level that you normally submit to. Because if you're used to submitting and publishing in rank 1 and 2, and you ask to review for rank 3 or 4, you might be much too exigeant. How would you say that in English?
Demanding.
Much too harsh.
Much too demanding.
And too demanding in your review in because that's not what you normally submit. So I mean, you might know as well the other journals where you don't publish. So I think it is not wise, beyond the fact of feeling obligated or not. I only accept when I'm specifically asked by colleagues who are stuck and ask me, could you please review that paper, because we can't find anybody qualified to do it, and we know you are qualified. So they know that I don't publish normally in their outlet, and that I might be too demanding, So as long as they know, that's okay. So I think it's not wise. It's not wise to review anywhere.
Okay. Okay, Isabella.
Yeah.
Okay, no, I'll summarize the comment because I'm recording. So you said that it's not wise to accept below the quality that you're normally used to because, yeah, you might be too harsh
Too unfair.
to them. Now, I have another perspective. I think part of, and one of, I'll come to that, but I think in part of being broad in reviewing things is having an ability to adjust our reviews in recognition of the level for which we're reviewing. In other words, and I'll come to that, that for me, I'll give the same comment regardless. I'll give the same amount of effort, but it's just the recommendation that would change depending on the level. So I do review for low level when I'm invited to if I'm below my quota, so to speak, and I can reasonably make the time, but I just adjust my recommendations. Okay. Some ethical principles, and ethics are always controversial, so please feel into disagree, to give other perspectives, to add points, subtract points. The first thing is conflicts of interest. Okay, so conflicts of interest, there are positive and negative conflicts. Positive is where you know who the authors are. Now, it's very interesting when you talk about this because a lot of researchers are not aware that there are such things as single blind journals. And a lot of researchers in other fields are not aware there are such things as double blind journals. So single blind review, that the blind means that the authors do not know who the reviewers are. That's almost always the case. Single blind means the reviewers do know the authors. The authors give their name, institutions, everything. They know who the authors are. Double blind means the reviewers do not know who the authors are. Some journals are single blind, some are double blind. And this division is mainly disciplinary. Some disciplines are almost all double blind, and all others are almost all single blind. Now, I straddle two disciplines. Information systems is almost always double blind. The reviewers don't know who the authors are. Computer science is always single blind. The reviewers virtually always know who the authors are. Each of them has high quality, low quality journals. It has nothing to do with the quality of the journal. It's a disciplinary preference. And there's all kinds of arguments for and against both kinds. But I will comment that research that has really researched these has found that single blind does discriminate against minorities, against women, against people whose names don't sound like they're from Western nations. That has been established by a number of research studies, so it does make a difference, but nonetheless, here it goes. So conflicts of interest, single blind, you know who the authors are, and so if you like the authors, you would like to accept their work because you know who they are, we have to say no. We are not objective review. We have a favorable bias towards them. If we don't like the authors, we don't agree with their perspective, we got into a fight with them, we're trying to get back at them, we should say no. We're not giving an unbiased thing. So that's for single blind. But double blind, especially today in the internet, it's easy to find out who the author is. You just do a search, you might find a conference paper, you look at the reference list, you see those that are cited a lot. Even with double blind, it's not that hard to find out who it is. And that actually is one of the strong arguments for single blind. That double blind is a waste of time, it doesn't work anyway. But the point is that even with double blind, sometimes we know who the authors are. Okay, so the thing is, okay, I'll come to that. We have to be honest. If we know it will give us positive or negative influence, we have to say no. Second, review contents are strictly confidential. The authors submit with the expectation the editors, the reviewers will not divulge anything of what they read to anyone until the work is published. And if the work is rejected from the review, we still have to wait until it is published somewhere else. Yes, Isabel. I suspected you had something to say about this.
Yeah, more and more in when people submit to top journals, they at the same time they put online previous versions of their work, and they are available online, even in double-blind journal. You know the article that I sent you, that was the case, and that told me I first refused to review it because it was online, and even though it was a ranked journal, the senior editor said nowadays most authors will put online a previous version of their paper, so that's not a valid reason to refuse. Okay, so in top tier journals, more and more the review process is so long that put online available versions of their papers, and this is the one I had sent you, the available version.
I'm sorry, let me just jump 2 points ahead. In double-blind review, we should not try to identify the authors. We should try to not, but like Isabel said, sometimes it's just there. Because we're not trying to identify them, we're just looking up to understand more about the topic, and it pops up there.
That's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, and with the internet, that is, before the internet you could talk about it, but in the age of the internet, it's not there. So Isabel's last point, that if we do recognize the authors, then tell the editor. And almost all the editor will say, no problem, because that's what we live in. But it's just that we have a responsibility, I think, if it's double-blind, if we identify the authors, tell the editor, we know who the authors are. And I've had that situation, and the editor said, no problem, you can go ahead and do the review. But that particular situation, there was a conflict of interest because it was a colleague I liked, and I wanted, anyway, I felt, no, I couldn't say yes in that case.
Well, the main conflict of interest I had on this issue, where I knew who I was reviewing, it's because I wanted to reject the paper, and I didn't want to have to reject the paper. So I said, I told the editor I had a conflict of interest.
Yeah.
The paper had been good, and I could have validated it. That was okay, it didn't bother me. But I didn't want to have to refuse a paper for somebody that I knew and that I worked with.
So that's why I said conflict of interest can be positive, or they can be negative. I'm sorry, Xavier?
Yeah, I had a point here which is related to having published previous versions. It now so happens that if you do publish a previous version online, the editor will specifically say that this is self-plagiarism and will refuse the paper.
Which journal did that?
Journal of Operations Management did it.
Okay.
Computers and Engineering did it.
Now it was published online.
Was available on a previous version. Was available online.
On what source? Available as a working paper?
As a working paper.
Okay, so.
And because it was available as a working paper, even though the version I had submitted was a much later one, it could be said that at least half of the paper was similar.
Yeah.
So that was considered to be self-plagiarism, and hence copyright infringement, and hence impossible to publish.
Did the editors use those words?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he said copyright infringement and self-plagiarism.
Okay, so let me comment on that. I'll repeat on record. So Xavier submitted an article to two different journals, and he already had a working paper online. The editor said that because it was the previous work online, not like conference or anything, that it was self-plagiarism, it's copyright infringement, and so it was not suitable for publication.
Not even admissible for review.
Not even admissible for review. Okay, so I have very strong opinions on this, and very controversial. First, well, the easy one is the editors, they don't know what copyright infringement means. That's not copyright infringement. As long as you own the copyright, you can do whatever you want with it. That's ridiculous. Legally, that's absolutely ridiculous. Self-plagiarism, so this is controversial. I do not believe self-plagiarism exists. I think it's a ridiculous idea. Plagiarism is pretending that someone else's work is your own. It's your work. You can't pretend it's your own. What is a real thing is multiple submission. Multiple submission is when you've already submitted something for publication elsewhere, and you submit the same thing or something too similar elsewhere. That is a problem. But there's a name for that. The name for that is multiple submission. Self-plagiarism is a name that people use to throw all kinds of things. Anyway, this is a controversial point. I get into this argument with people all the time.
Yeah. Yes, but she too, some people publish the same thing, exactly the same thing twice, sometimes in different outlets. And that's wrong.
But Isabel, that's what I call multiple submission. It is wrong. But there's a name for it. The name is not self-plagiarism. The name is multiple submission.
Well, it's not multiple submission because you can submit in multiple outlets and not publish in in all the outlets.
You can retry the.
You can try but not publish. But some people do publish the same thing exactly in different outlets, and that's completely wrong. As I do bibliography studies, I can tell you every time I do a new study, I actually meet this in every field, in every subject, and this is completely wrong.
I agree with you.
The usual norm is at least to modify 30% from one article to the next. If you publish in a conference and you then want to submit to a journal, you have to change the article at least 30%.
Okay, Isabel. So here, for me, Xavier's example is a perfect case that shows why I think self-plagiarism is nonsense. What he did is not copyright infringement. There's no law he infringed. Second, it is not multiple submission. He did not publish it online. It's not published in a way that prevents publication elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with publishing your work online and then submitting it to a journal. And so in order to make it sound bad, the editors, they pulled this word self-plagiarism. That's all it is. It just labels things when they have nothing to say. It just sounds horrible. And it means nothing on its own. So that, anyway, so I always attack the term self-plagiarism. I always decompose it. It's just used to call names. Say, no, call things what they are, break down, and when you break it down, then you know there's nothing wrong with it. There's no, he did not plagiarize, he did not do multiple submission, he did not copyright infringe, he did nothing wrong. Now there is a journal, at least I'm sure other journals said this, that if you submit to them, and if you have a working paper online, you have to take it down first during the review process.
Yeah,
that's reasonable.
Actually, that was asked.
Yeah.
It says because there exists another copy,
take it down, and then it can be reviewed. That's reasonable. But to accuse him of self-plagiarism, copyright, that's ridiculous. So, my opinion. I research copyright law. That's part of my open content research, so I have a lot of opinion on this area. Okay, so going on, and this is related to the last comment of review content are confidential. We must never use unpublished ideas or new knowledge learned from review until the article is published. People call this stealing ideas. Again, my opinion, I don't believe ideas can be stolen. I believe ideas are free, but ideas can be appropriated. There is a professional courtesy and ethics where the first person to have an idea has the right to publish it first. And so to someone we got an idea from and publish it first is wrong. So, and peer review gives us the ability to do that. We should not abuse that privilege. Now, of course, if someone presents something in their article and they're referring to work that has already been published, whether by them or someone else, of course, as long as it's published, that's new That's part of the idea of learning from peer review.
Yeah.
But if we learn something new from their study, we have to seal our mouths until it is published. Or if they have a working paper, and based on that, then we can speak it. So this is part of the confidentiality of our peer review. Then we've already talked about double blind, so I won't say more on that. And this one is controversial, but it should not be controversial. We should never cite ourselves in our reviews. When we recommend changes that people should make, when we recommend look at this resource, we should not cite ourselves. Now, the reason for this, the reason why I have this perspective, is that it is unfair. We have a power relationship over the authors, where they have to do almost everything we say just to get accepted. And if they don't agree, then we're less likely to recommend acceptance. And therefore, they are constrained by this unequal power relationship to cite our work, which is in our personal interest. For me, that's not fair. Okay, lots of opinion. Amitabh, please.
Actually, yeah, no. I mean, I wouldn't call it as a self-citation because, for example, in Journal of Knowledge Management, when I see a lot of, they actually don't say that, like self-citing. Some people say that, in the previous version of the studies that we did, and they cite, Citing Bonte's 2017A, and they take the theory from there and try to build a new theory.
Okay, no, I'm sorry, Amitabh. No, I'm not talking about the authors citing themselves. I'm talking about the authors have their article, I'm a reviewer, and I say, hey, you should look at this article by Okoli 2015.
No, I'll come to that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think in the humility papers about Journal of Business Ethics, I could sense very clearly, our paper was written in JBE. I could clearly sense that, the reviewer who was reviewing was the one whom we criticized, not like criticized, but trying to justify the question.
Okay.
So we realized that because he used the comment that, I am extremely disappointed by the way the authors have represented. I have not seen any reviewer saying completely disappointed or extremely disappointed. These are the words the reviewer uses. I started to question myself.
No, about self-citation when you review, I don't 100% agree on that. Yes, I do believe we should avoid citing ourselves. But if we've been asked specifically to review because of our knowledge in a given field, the person ignores completely that knowledge, we have unfortunately to cite ourselves.
Okay.
If we produce some specific bit of work for which we've been asked for, it's very difficult. I mean, I was once in this position and I was uncomfortable. Otherwise, I usually, in effect, avoid citing myself, but if there's nobody else to cite, you have to cite yourself.
Okay, so Isabel says that sometimes when that is your area of expertise, and the person obviously missed something very important that you talked about in your published work, you have little choice but to cite yourself. So Isabel, I've been in that situation several times, and here's how I deal with that. I take what is the knowledge they need to know in order to get around this. I take that knowledge, I write it in my own words, and I put it in my review. I tell them directly what they need to do.
That would be your article.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's right, but I put it in my own words. I don't just copy and paste from my article, but from the article that I think they should read that should help them, I tell them that knowledge, I write it afresh in new words, and give it to them, directly customized to their situation, and knowledge to them. Then, because I think that reading the whole article would help them a lot, I write a personal note to the editor and say, editor, I really think that my article, would help these, but I don't want to cite myself. So if you think it would be helpful, you mention it to them. And see, here's why I like to do that. Because I have a conflict of interest. I want them to cite my work. And yet I can't trust that I'm just doing it out of pure motive. So I let the editor make that choice.
I'll try that next
So that's how I avoid citing myself.
That's a good idea. That's a good
Okay.
idea.
Yeah, I'll try
Okay.
that one.
Okay.
See, I'm very often, I'm often very in a difficult position because I've started to write quite a few methodological work, and I'm often asked to review for the methodological
For sure.
part.
I totally understand the conflict. I've been in that conflict quite a few times because I'm also invited for methodological reasons. And yeah. Okay. That's how I deal with that. But this is a controversial point, but something we need to reflect on. Because I'm sure we've all been on the receiving end, and we don't really like how it feels. Okay. So now we come to the goals and recommendation criteria for a review. So the fundamental goals, I see that there are two fundamental goals. There could be more, please add more. First should be, we want to be a helpful colleague. A colleague is asking for feedback on their work, and our mindset should be, we want to help them to improve their article for publication. That should be our goal. We're trying to help them improve the quality of their work. The second is a gatekeeper goal. There's a journal or a conference with limited space, with limited slots for publication, and we are helping determine whether this article is worth giving one of those limited slots. That's a gatekeeper. And for me, I try to be very sensitive to when I am in situations of social power over people. I've suffered under people abusing power, and I want to not be part of that problem. I try to recognize when I have some kind of power, a lot of power, a little power over people, and try not to abuse it. So recognizing that serving as a gatekeeper, I have some power, I really try to be sensitive to not abuse that power in any way. Yes, Isabel.
Yeah, I think here I would like to comment on that, and I think as a reviewer, I think you need two things are very, very important, and a number of times in my editorial role, humility and humanity. Okay, humility, it's not because you are asked to review or because you're a good publisher, you've published a lot of things, that you have to get your head too big and be very insulting to the people that you're reviewing. Humility is essential. And humanity, I mean, people submit articles, sometimes they've worked on these articles for years. If you are very harsh and very hard on these people, it could destroy them. I think as reviewers, we must be aware of the damage we can do. And Lee's advice, the article by Lee, is very good because it starts by saying, whatever happens, try and find something good to say about the article, even if you're going to reject it. If it hasn't been just rejected by the editor-in-chief, or the associate editor, that means there is something potentially good in this article. So find it and highlight it before you go and dive and kill the article. Okay? I cannot insist too much. Humility and humanity. That okay. I've never seen it written as such in any advice to reviewers. And I think it should be really highlighted.
Okay, so Isabel highlighted two crucial points. First is humility. No matter how much you know, well, realize that you don't know everything. And take that perspective. And second, humanity. You're dealing with human beings. You need to realize we have feelings. And one good piece of advice from Alan Lee is find something good to say about the article no matter what. There's got to be something good to say about it. Yeah, thanks, Isabel.
Otherwise, it would have been desk rejected.
Yeah, I think that's the point.
But then how about the poor editors who have to desk reject? But I'm actually going to talk on that point. The anyway, that's one of the things coming here.
Yeah,
So-
Amitabh and I are working on the
Okay.
subject of humility.
Yes, I know.
Sorry, I have to go.
Okay, thanks,
See you,
Amitabh.
Amitabh.
Okay. So now, when
Okay,
so then how do we make a decision? So there's some criteria for journal articles, a little bit different for conference. I'll explain why, but I'll talk about journal articles first. So primarily, I like to focus on giving concrete tips and strategies for improving the article for publication. Again, for improving the article, that's the primary focus, in that journal. So Isabel, you mentioned earlier that if the journal is below the quality level that you're used to, it might not even be fair to agree to review it. I try to, I give recommendations, I do my recommendations no matter what I give. I try to give the same amount of effort no matter what level it is. But then when it comes to the recommendation, I consider what is the level of that journal, what's the level of quality, and I tailor recommendations with the context in view. Then, if the revisions that we have come up with are feasible, that is, I've maybe written a lot of revisions, they might be a lot, they might be a few, but I think these can be done. It's going to take some work, but it can be done. Then I recommend revise and resubmit. Be either major or minor. For me, the distinction is major is, for me, it's going to be a lot of work. And if they don't do that a lot of work, then I would recommend reject. I think it's necessary in order to be suitable for that journal, but it's going to be a lot of work. Minor revisions are, in my judgment, it's not that much work. It's quite feasible, doable. And it's also, to say minor revisions is a signal that the article is close, that I'm probably going to eventually recommend accept if they do these things that I think should be quite do. Then, however, if the revisions I've recommended are so much that, you know what, let me be honest about what these people are trying to do, my revisions to redeem be another article. They have to collect a new data set. They have to go from a completely different theory basis. In other words, this is really going to become like a completely different article based on the revisions I recommended, and no minor revisions will make it redeemable. Then I would recommend rejection.
Not to revise and resubmit.
No, if I think it's going to be so much that it will a completely other article, that is what I'm recommending is not true to what the authors were initially trying to do, and I don't see any minor things they can do that will make it okay, then that's kind of my criterion for recommending rejection, when I feel it's irredeemable for this journal, unless they redo the study.
Exactly.
Then I will give them the revisions, the recommendations, but I'll recommend reject. That's
For
it.
that particular one. But
Yes.
maybe resubmit in this new, completely new article.
Well, if we submit a new article, that's the editor's recommendation. That's not for me as a reviewer to recommend. If I recommend reject, it's for the editor to recommend you can and then resubmit. And actually, that's my last point here I'm coming to. But even when we recommend reject, we still need to give advice. One is what would be necessary for the article to be eventually published in that journal that they targeted. And then also sometimes way we would think, you know, this article cannot be redeemed in this journal or a journal of that level. They can only publish it, maybe a journal of a lower level might accept it. Then recommend the revisions that would be necessary for that. Then one point to remember, and this varies according to the journal, is, but I try to just keep one standard. I do not make the decision. So I never tell the author in the article, I recommend revision, I recommend rejection. Because that decision is for the editor.
That's a mistake that is done very often by reviewers, and sometimes experienced reviewers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's surprising when they actually write in the review, this is why I reject your paper.
Yeah.
That's not their
Right.
I mean,
the reviewers cannot make the decision, and the editor can always override the decision because maybe the other reviewers disagree or something. Now, one reason I think reviewers do that is that some journals ask you to recommend, and the reviewer and the authors see your recommendation. Other journals don't. So I think that's one of the reasons you see reviewers doing both. There is not one standard. Some do ask for a recommendation that is visible to the authors. But for me to be standard, I never recommend unless the journal asks me to make a recommendation. Then in my written review, I don't make a recommendation there. I just give the vote. I think European Journal of Information Systems does that. At the end, they ask you, what's your vote? And so some journals do that. And a lot of conferences do that too. Then
they ask you for an opinion. So you
yes.
have choices.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. If they ask you for opinion, you choose. Exactly.
Revision, major revision.
But in my written comments, I never say what my recommendation is. However, in private comments to the editor, then I can get into detail why I recommend rejection or recommend or whatever.
Yeah, I do the same.
Okay. Now, conferences are a little bit different, and also journal special issues. For the reason that there's a time limit, there's a tight schedule, and so there's no time for major revisions. So if the revisions required for acceptance are major, then I have to reject, because there's no time for major revisions. You can only, because of the time limit. The special issues sometimes might have more time, but conferences, no. If it's not acceptable with minor revisions, then it's not acceptable. However, even then...
Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Just a comment on that.
Yes, Pierre.
For me to be sure about what for special issues, as far as I know, for the ones I analyzed, we have something, or they have something like 1 year, and as far as I know, we should take something like 1 month or 2 months in order to review, in order to update, even if it's major revisions. In that case, you have time to ask for major revisions.
So that's why I said, first of all, for conference articles usually type.
Okay.
For the special issue, it's relative to how much time do you have. So it's all that's the issue. It's different from regular journals because regular journals don't have such a tight time limit. So it's just when there's a time limit, you consider your recommendation based on that. But regardless, I still give the same review because again, this is just for the recommendation. For the comments, I give the same quality revision, the same quality comments that I would for a regular article. And even if I recommend rejection, I give them typically what would be necessary to eventually get it published in a journal. Okay, and which for a conference, for me personally, when I submit to conferences, the best feedback I get is from the reviewers. Whether the article is accepted or rejected, that's the best. And if the reviewers give me very good feedback with a reject, I can take it then to revise it for a journal. Because usually when I present, I don't get better feedback from that. So a rejection, so please don't do a short rejection, 1 paragraph. Give detailed comments how they can get it to journal publication, and this is very useful. Okay, then this last part I'll go through quickly because everyone has their procedure of actually doing the review. This is my way of doing the review, and it has evolved over years. We each find a style that works for us. I said I recently attended a workshop on reviewing. People have very different styles. We find what works for us. So these are just some principles that might be helpful. However, the first thing to say is to take note of the attitude and tone of the review. And so our mindset should be not primarily gatekeeper. I'm trying to decide whether to accept or reject. Our mindset should be primarily helpful colleague. I'm looking for ways to help these authors improve their work. And one of the practical things is that for every weakness I identify, I take some time and consider what solution could I propose? I try to practice no weakness identified without a solution proposed. Sometimes I can't find a solution. Maybe it's an area I'm not expert in, and then I'll say so. But 9 times out of 10, for every weakness I identify, I propose a solution. Otherwise, we're not being very helpful. Secondly, I try to think in the mindset, if I were one of the co-authors trying to fix the article, what would I do? So that makes me, because we can recommend, you should go collect new data, and everything. Yeah, they took 3 years to collect that data. I'm asking them to collect another 3. So I try to put myself in their shoes. What is feasible? What would I actually do where I am? So I try to think in that mindset in making my recommendations. Then a very simple principle that helps me a lot in my tone in this matter of humanity, speaking to them as normal human beings as I like to be spoken to, is I always address the authors as you, in second person. For example, say, you did not clearly explain your reasons for this, or you should have collected this kind of data as well, and I find that just a lot of reviews say the authors did or they says this. And when we speak in third person, then it's easier to be harsh and unfeeling. But when I say you, I try to pretend that they are sitting face to face across from me from the table, and I'm giving them friendly feedback. And I said that, the last point here, I said, always write as if giving advice to respected colleagues, because they are respected colleagues. They are our peers. And so try to have this. So this is the tone, regardless of what I actually say. Then my procedure, my very personal procedure. First, I do a summary but detailed pre-reading. And that is basically, I kind of read the outline, but in detail. So first, I read the title, the abstract, the keywords, and the entire introduction. This gives me the idea of what the article is supposed to be. Then, I read the core outline. By core outline, I mean I read all the section headers, every header, every level. I look at all the figures, and I try to understand what is this figure showing. I look at all the tables and try to understand what are these tables showing, and I try to get the story from the headers, the figures and tables. I read the conclusion if it's short. If it's too long, then I skip that. I look at the appendices. If there's appendices, I look at the headers, at least of the appendices, to get what's there. So I really take my time to do this. I spend 15 to 30 minutes just doing this outline reading, because it gives me a general idea of the subject, the structure, the direction of the article. And actually, this is the way I read articles all the time. This is the way I read any scholar, even if I'm not reviewing. I always do the outline. And when I do this first, then I have questions, because there's a lot of things I don't understand. What does this term mean? Why is this important? Why did they use this procedure? And I write down my questions, because when I now come to the detailed reading with questions, my reading is much more active. So after doing this summary reading first, then I come to the careful, detailed, full reading of the article. I go back, I reread everything from the introduction, then I read the entire article in order. And as I read, there are some questions that I focus on. So I might have general questions for my first reading, but there are some particular questions. First of all, what? Do the authors explain what they're doing? The facts of their procedure? Do they explain things clearly, what they are actually doing? Then so what? Why does it matter? What's the point of this topic? Who cares? Did the authors tell us this? Did they take it for granted that this is important and just go into it? Or did they take the time to explain why this is important, who it's relevant for, why they did the procedures, why it matters? Then how did they tackle the research objectives or the research questions? What is the procedure? Is it the right procedure to answer those kind of questions, to fulfill those kinds of objectives? Then finally, did they solve the problem? Did they succeed in convincingly resolving the problem that they set out to resolve? There's a lot of things we can think of. Here I have a link from the Academy of Management, some suggestions for reviewers of their annual meetings, and has a lot of very good points of things to look for in a review, the kind of things to comment on and to give authors feedback on. And are there any points that anyone can add that when you review, you tend to some key important questions?
I think you've covered most of it.
Okay. Okay. While I'm doing all this, I write detailed comments. I read the PDF. I write comments all over the place. So then, when I've done all,
I could just add one thing. It's just practice. Usually, I first read very quickly in between. In between, you go back and we read the introduction, then read the entire article. I usually go over the full article. I read it once very fast.
Okay.
Without commenting or writing anything, just deciding in my head really if I'm going to review for improvement or review for reject.
Okay.
You didn't mention anywhere is that you don't review in the same way for improvement that you review for reject. And in fact, reviewing for reject takes much more time, because if you are a decent reviewer, you try and transform your reject into that you mentioned. This is what you should do to get your article published eventually.
Okay.
I'm inclined to give much more information when I reject than when I don't reject.
Okay. So Isabel pointed out that before she does the detailed reading, she does a quick reading of everything without making comments, and usually this gives her the idea of, is she going, when she does the detailed reading, is this a review to recommend revision, or is it to recommend revision or resubmit, or is it a review for rejection? Actually, when she decides to review for rejection, she's going to give a lot more comments with details of why it's being rejected and how it could be improved and so on. So Isabel, this perspective is very interesting. So I said this is my personal approach. In the seminar I attended this summer on reviewing, well, actually, I attended two seminars. One of them was not on reviewing, but it was like how we answer reviews. But one of the interesting points that was presented is that reviewers usually make the decision mentally to revise and resubmit or recommend rejection by the time they finish reading the introduction. That's usually the case.
No, I don't. I always have flown off quickly.
So Isabel, once you read the whole thing. But I'm not talking about you in particular. I'm just saying that this was what was said there. I don't know if it's backed by scientific studies or so on. And that was from the perspective that we as authors, we need to spend a lot of time on the introduction. But one of the corollaries, personally, I try to suspend that decision in my mind as much as possible. So that's why this is my approach. I try not to decide whether I recommend rejection or not. And I mean, I'm human. I do have an initial feeling often, but I try to suppress and not make that decision until I've done all this and I look at the recommendations and I come back, can it be saved or not? And this is just my personal approach. And
I just want to correct something that I said. When I say I give more details when I reject, I don't give overall more details. It's obvious that when you ask for a revision, you're going to ask very precise revision. What I mean by that is that I give precise details why I reject.
Okay.
And the first quick reading of the article, usually if there is a major flaw, the first reading gives it to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I usually, not 100%, but 80% of the time, if I find a major flaw, I know I'm going to reject it.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
major flaw
Okay.
being either logical or the wrong approach to an issue.
Okay. So Isabel clarified that in her first reading, if she decides reject, it's because she saw a major flaw, not just for a feeling, and that she spends more time to explain why that's a flaw. So obviously she gives a lot of detail for when she recommends revision as well. Okay. So then after going through this and organize my final review, then I organize it. The first thing I always do, I've learned this from reviewers who have reviewed my work, even if they accepted it or rejected it. I begin with a short paragraph. I kind of write my own abstract of the study. And the reason I is to make sure that I really understand what they try to do and to let them realize that I understand what they were trying to do. Then I summarize the parts of the article that I like best. So this is like exactly like what Isabel mentioned earlier. No matter how bad I think the article is, I've got to find something to say about it. And the thing is that it's easy to find problems. It's not so easy to find good things to say always. But unless it is a pure evil article that talks about the best way to cut up rabbits in little pieces, there's something that can good to about it. We need to find it and say it. This is not being untruthful. This is being broad-minded. And so find something good and say it. Start with that. So I absolutely agree with that point, Isabel. Then I group my concerns, my comments, into 2 to 5 major issues, usually 2 or 3. Here are the major issues. Whether I recommend revision or rejection, here are the major issues, and I group them into large categories, and I then arrange all my comments in those major categories. And anything that does not fall into these 2 to 5, usually 2 or 3 major categories, anything that doesn't fall into these major concerns is a minor comment. So I take the time to do this. People vary in how much time they take to do reviews. I estimate review can take me from as little as 3 hours, usually like a short conference article, to as much as 8 hours, not necessarily in one day, but over the number of days I do it. Sometimes longer, depending on the article, how familiar I am with it, and so on. And my journal article reviews, I went back and I did word count. Journal article reviews are usually 2,000 to 5,000 words. And conference article reviews are usually 1,000 to 2,000 words. So this is for me personally. And when I see other reviewers, I find a lot of the time my reviewers tend to be longer than others, but not always. It just depends. So comments, I want to say something about that. What is a minor comment? For me, the majority of my comments will be in the minor comment section. If it's not one, and I like to consider them minor because that puts me in the right mindset. I identify the 2 to 5 truly major things, and everything else is minor. I don't want to go into detail on something that's a major concern. So that's why I like to get my categories. Maybe just a little bit of grounded theory and write my reviews. I get my major categories, and then I classify all my comments. Which major category does it fall into? If it doesn't fall into one of the 2 to 5, usually not more than 3 major concerns, it's a minor comment. It all falls into the minor comment section. Then one important type of minor comment, grammar and spelling, is always a minor comment. No matter how annoyed I get because they have so many typos, I mentally say, I will not be annoyed. I will not evaluate your paper based on how annoyed your errors made me. As long as I can read it and understand, I put that aside because I'm not proofreading your paper. If there are many errors, I don't point them all out. I might point out one or two, then when I realize there's a lot, then I have a standard text like this that I put as my first comments. There are numerous minor spelling and grammatical errors throughout the article, though none so serious that it caused difficulty to understand you. There, I have a grammatical error in my statement there. Instead of pointing them out, I will simply recommend that you have a professional proofreader correct the final accepted version of this manuscript. And that's it. I don't say anything more than that. And I try not to, because most of these people are not native English speakers. I've had I had an article. Reviewer started out by saying that I really like this article, but it's really frustrating when you like an article, the article is spoiled by the terrible grammar that they use. And I'm a native English speaker. So I don't do that. And the reason I'm insisting on this is that a lot of the time, grammar spelling errors put us in the wrong tone, in the wrong attitude. I fight to not let that influence my attitude, because a proofreader can fix that. Let me try to see what is the substance of what they're saying.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, Isabel.
Yeah, there's just one thing I would like to add on the previous slide when you said most of my reviews, I do them in 3 to 8 hours. I don't know about you, but I never completely an article the same day. I usually look at an article I have to review on at least 2 or 3 or 4 occasions. The time spent is about right, but it's split between 2, 3, 4 occasions.
Actually, Isabel, I should have mentioned that because that's the same thing with me. But yeah, I usually sit down like 8 hours and do it. It's usually at least 2 or 3 sessions. Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, I think we have to cut it now. I thank you all for having listened on.